Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me for my talk today on why does code always rot? Looking at code without looking at code. So a brief introduction of me. My name is Chris and I currently work at Shopify, more specifically Shopify Plus, as a senior software developer. Obligatory, it's a conference. We are hiring. We would love to hear from you. But before I start into my talk, I want to just do a quick thank you. I wanted to quickly say thank you to the entire JavaScript and Friends organizing team and all the other speakers that have prepared talks for this conference. This is my first conference talk, and preparing it during these times has proved challenging, and I really appreciate the pivot that the team did and is still managing to bring everything together to spread some learning around. I think you all did a great job. I just wanted to say thank you for doing it. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about code rot and what I mean. So most code starts with a simple problem that we're trying to solve. That problem scope kind of grows over time, and we add code to address that growing scope. Eventually, you look at it and wonder, how did it even get to the state that it is right now? Everybody's gone to a company, opened up some piece of the code base, and wondered, how did we ever let this happen? And that's what this presentation is about. I'm not going to discuss any new frameworks or any coding patterns. In fact, I'm going to go on a limb and assume that everyone watching this wants to build high-quality, scalable software that they can all be proud of. I'm sure that you do that right now in your current jobs, and you still have parts of your code base that are rotted. I'm even willing to bet that some of that code went from what somebody would deem not rotted to rotted while you were even there, which means it happened on your watch. So does that make you a bad engineer or a bad manager or a bad person? No, I don't think you're a bad engineer, manager, or person, because this happens to everyone. And I think that if we try to be a little bit proactive about it, we can try to figure out the places where and why it happens, and then maybe we can do some stuff about it. So it all comes down to this diagram. And this diagram is sort of this idea of like, it starts with your environment that you have at work. That environment feeds a certain mindset. Those mindsets drive certain behaviors that will slowly change the environment. And it's sort of a feedback cycle that goes back and forth around all this. So I once had a friend actually that worked at a large company. Excellent developer, one of the best developers I've ever met. But he was a bit of a perfectionist. And he felt that if it wasn't perfect, it wasn't actually done. I'm going to call him Fred. So Fred would go to these meetings with people where they would discuss sort of near-term future goals, road mapping, things like that. And he was still fairly new, but had been there long enough to know there was some reasonable technical debt to address. But the tech leads, during those meetings, seemed pretty confident. The parts that Fred had the most concerns about dealt with a part of the service where the main contributor had recently left. He wasn't sure if the tech leads had a plan for that yet, but the product was moving forward, people loved what the company was putting out, and everything seemed pretty good from externally in. He used to tell me that they were very results-oriented. One feature a week, he used to tell me. That was the goal, one feature a week. So after these meetings, Fred would go back to his computer and he'd pull out this little side project that he wrote a long time ago, a small web scraper for a very specific task. List the coffees that are being served today at the local coffee shop down the street. So you could run that in a little kind of terminal command. It would list the 5 different kind of coffees. And it was about 80 lines of code, give or take. He could choose if he wanted that coffee and then maybe walk the 80 meters to the coffee shop or not. But at 80 lines of code, he called it his closet code because nobody touched it. He even had test coverage for it. And he just loved how simple it was, and it was like perfect. And he would always go back to that after these kinds of meetings. Just pull it up, look at the code, kind of like zen himself out. Some people look at landscapes. Fred looked at closet code. And he did this because Fred felt like nothing would ever change. So what are we actually talking about here? Okay, in the previous example alone, all 3 of these things sort of came into play. And we'll break these down and possibly revisit parts of the example I did before. So I'm going to talk about the Hedonic Principle, or Treadmill, depending on which way you want to name it, and hedonic motivation that goes hand in hand with that. I'm going to talk about box knowledge and what that really means, and the concept of conformity in your team, especially regarding new hires. So when it comes to the hedonic treadmill, hedonic is really just a Greek term, and it means in relating to or considered a term of pleasant sensations. It's usually studied in the terms of raising the base happiness levels over time. But what I'm actually really interested in is the negative of that, the the interest, the negative side of that side of the hedonic principle. So if you take a look at this diagram here, you can kind of see what I mean. The baseline of happiness, that sort of horizontal line, you have moments in your life where things good happen, and you have moments in your life where things bad happen. But you can see that the idea around this is like the base level of happiness doesn't really change that much over time. In fact, 75% of the general population have a baseline level of happiness that isn't actually significantly impacted after even major events. Now, of course, there's exceptions to these major events, huge traumatic experiences, long-term disability that is thrust onto someone. These are things that are sort of exceptional. But even one study found that major events had a short-term decrease and eventually returned to near levels, with candidates being asked, hey, over the next 2 years, how do you think your happiness level is going to change? And the vast majority of them said they would either stay where they are now or they foresee themselves getting better over the next 2 years. That baseline happiness, sort of their general level of happiness kind of raising back up to where that baseline used to be. So just like how we can have good moments, be really like euphoric, and then we kind of go back down. Think of like the standard examples of I bought a new car, I got a raise at my job, those kinds of things. You're very happy, but then you sort of like go back down to where you were before. The same thing happens with bad things that happen in our life. We feel bad in the moment, but over time, that fades. So what does this mean for software? You're going to ask me, you're not talking about divorce, we're talking about software. You're not talking about breaking an arm, you're talking about software. So what are we actually talking about? And I can give you a concrete example. So actually I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read this while I take a sip of my tasty beverage. I think everybody, or most people, would have had something around this happen to them in their career. That dreaded ping, that dreaded on-call ping, where everything's on fire, nobody knows what's going on, shit's being impacted and the company's losing money, or at least losing trust with their customers. Do you remember what your physiological response was when this happened? Maybe the first, second, third, fifth time, whatever it is. I still have it happen. You know it's happened a bunch of times. Your heart rate increases, your cortisol goes up, your stress increases, your mind starts to quickly dash between all these different possible causes. You know, while you're still waking up, by the way, it's like 1 a.m. and you're groggy and you're like, oh, could it be it's a Redis issue? Could it be a database problem? I can't. And then you start thinking like, okay, well, what could have caused this? What was the last deploy that went out? Why is it happening now at midnight? Who else knows about this? Who is it affecting? Who should we tell? Should we tell those people? What should we tell them? How far do we go down? Do we update the status page? Do we escalate it up? I've just covered the first 30 seconds of you waking up, and that's pretty negative, right? Like that's pretty bad. What I just went through here, I bet you're already stressed a little bit more just based on what I just said, and it's not even a real thing that's happened. And I haven't even asked the worst question yet. The worst question of all: Did you do this? Is this your fault? Is it my fault? So you're gonna say stop. Just stop right there, because we do postmortems, we do RCAs. This is software, and these things happen in software. You will not shame me, sir. And I say, yeah, I know. Of course you do RCAs. Root cause analysis, by the way. Of course you do postmortems. I mean, everybody does this, right? Okay. But maybe we're talking about two different things. What if you're driving your car and you actually take a turn too wide and you go into the ditch? See, there's probably some self-reflection that you can do on your driving habits around that, especially if it happens multiple times. See, that's why insurance goes up when you do stuff like that, because they're like, I don't really trust you anymore. But what if your brakes that you just got changed completely stop working, and that's what puts you in the ditch? I mean, there's no amount of retro now that's going to save that. It doesn't matter. It's outside of your domain. So if we bring that back to software and we explode it out into scope, listen, if AWS goes down, chances are people are going to have a lot of problems, right? But I'm not talking about AWS going down. I'm talking about bugs in your software. And if I'm going to talk about bugs, then we need to take a little bit of a tangent, digression, and actually define what a bug really is. So what's in the name when it comes to bugs? A bug is when something isn't working the way it was designed to work. And that's so important that I'm going to purposefully read it again. A bug is when something isn't working the way it was designed to work. So I'm going to look at a really simple case study to illustrate what I mean. Collectibles in video games. So in a video game, typically, I just played two back-to-back that are kind of similar in how they did this. You go around, you're walking around the world, you see this shiny thing, you're like, oh, that's kind of cool, let me go pick that up. So you pick it up, and in the game, in the bottom right corner, you have a little thing that says, hey, you just picked up this thing. Do you want to check it out? It's a collectible. And you're like, damn right, I want to check it out. So you press it. And it takes you to the in-game menu. And that in-game menu may have several categories or whatever, but one of those categories is probably collectibles. So you go over to that category, you scroll over to it, and you're like, oh, okay, I want to check out this collectible. So you click it. And it's like, well, now it's in a list. You have a bunch of collectibles. And those collectibles could be in subcategories, but I didn't want to draw too much stuff. So you look at this sub-list here, and you have this little one that's highlighted, and you're like, oh, okay, let me go and check that out. You go there, and it has the preview on the right-hand side. But I don't know, I sit like, 10 feet away from my TV. I can't read the preview, it's too small. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to not be able to read it. So I have to click on it, so that the preview turns into the full screen. And I'm like, okay, well now I can see the collectible. And I just picked it up. That was 4 interactions from the time that I picked it up to the time I could actually go and see the thing that I picked up. So what if we do a separate, what if we, the other game that I played? Same thing, walk around the world, see the shiny, click on it, little thing comes up contextually, hey, you picked up this thing, I click on it, and as soon as I do that, it goes immediately to that last view of the other one. So that's arguably 1 or 2 interactions depending on how you want to take a look at it, right? So the reason here that I'm talking about this is one is clearly better than the other, but the first one that I said isn't a bug. It's just bad. It's just a bad design. It was probably functioning the way that they intended. It's an afterthought. It was something they didn't really think through that much. So it didn't work. So I wanted to highlight this because I want to be very, very clear that if something isn't working as expected right now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bug. Bad design is bad design. And a change in behavior is a feature, it's not a bug. Okay, back to where we were there. So why do we make bugs? Well, I mean, because we're all human and everybody makes mistakes. The distinction that I just made between the issue and the bug is just very important, so I want to drive it home. It's based on mistakes we make, not poor design decisions we make. So what happens when we make mistakes? Well, this is kind of the root of the hedonic motivation. The idea of wanting to avoid pain and tending towards pleasure in the everyday decisions that you make. So as an example, have you ever met someone that was defensive about breaking something or not getting something included in a sprint? Do you know anyone who doesn't want to take blame for something or tries to place it on others? What about someone that downplays consequences? Or have you ever heard the term, I'm sorry you feel that way, but, and insert thing. These are all ways to avoid pain internally. We're shielding ourselves from emotion by employing these tactics. So in software, lending towards pleasure is actually usually building something new, like a feature. Everybody gets excited about building new things and building something they can put their name on it. I built this thing and look at it in the wild. So that call happens, right? The one I mentioned at midnight. You had that rough night, and then you say never again. You shake your fists, like old man grandpa here, and you shake your fist at the sky. And you do your postmortem, furiously type it the next day because you're so pissed maybe. Maybe you have a meeting, maybe you assign action items. But the company has to go on. There's hungry customers and they want more things. They want more features. And before you know it, that night you had, that shaking fist, that postmortem you did, it's not forgotten, but it's faded. And the hard work is difficult to justify because it slows down that new stuff that everybody loves so much. So everything fades quicker than you would actually might think that it would. As a good example, hey, how many of you have to-dos in your code right now that are older than 6 months or a year? How many to-dos do you have that if you were to read the to-do, you'd be like, I don't even know what this is talking about. I have no idea. Yeah. Of course you do. Everybody does. So that's kind of my point. But it works the other way too, right? A new feature is exciting when it happens, but it's quickly replaced with a chase to the next one. So here you have the situation where you have the good and the bad is actually forgotten in pursuit of the same thing. this newness that I'm talking about, this next thing to build. So now we have lower quality features that may break more often, and they usually have a select few people that know the intricacies around them. So now we're on to problem number 2, box knowledge. People don't stay long enough, especially in smaller companies. In larger companies, the tenure tends to be a little bit longer, but in smaller companies, it's shorter. Learning under pressure is really hard. Sharing takes time to do that. You have to include that idea in your planning. And then there's the idea of comfort zones. I'll go through each of these separately. So normally, if I was doing this in person, I'd take a poll and I'd say, how many people that are here right now have been at their company at least 1 year? And you'd have like a lot of them. Even if I say less than 1 year, 2 a year, a lot of people put their hands up and say, yeah, I've been there. How about 2 years? Some hands are good. 3 years? Some hands would really go down. And I'd say, well, what about 3 years, but your company has less than 200 people? And then, I mean, you can't see it in person right now because there's nobody here, but you'd have very few hands left up because that's sort of what happens. Tenure tends to only be around larger companies. So when you have this idea of new people and impact, a reasonable frequency of new people coming in and out, especially in smaller companies, it's a blessing and a curse because while it can bring new ideas, you have to remember what we just talked about. New people want to make an impact quickly. They want to assimilate quickly. And so it's easy to understand why they would tend toward shipping features to increase their impact. It's a lot easier to put their stamp on something. I don't think developers are willfully ignoring quality to ship fast and get noticed. This isn't something that they're thinking through at night. But I think most of this is pretty passive, and it becomes additive over time. Think about your own teams. Do you have any like bus or lottery factor concerns for any part of your software? How long has it been like that? Why is it still like that? You're not actively trying to put more responsibility onto one person. Or what about the person that knows the microservice or specific part of the code so well that when a bug comes up, they can just fix it from somebody describing them? They can do it in 30 minutes. These are all forms of comfort zones or bubbles. And they're tough to combat when things are good. So let's look at it a different way. Let's imagine your team is a boat. Okay, and your boat is adapted to specific waters. So minor changes in the waters, like that picture to the right there, are okay. It goes left and right, and it may be a little up and maybe a little down. You know, nothing too crazy, right? But it's really difficult to plan. If this has been going on for a long time, it's actually really difficult to plan ahead when things are good, because you don't know things are possibly bad, or there's some sort of beginning of rot underneath. We're living through that right now. A lot of people had to make a lot of really fast adjustments when COVID happened, and nobody could have seen that coming and nobody could have planned for it. There are some people that would be more adapted to it because they may have some baseline strategies around something like this in the genre of it, but nothing to the extent that it's been, at least not for the vast majority of people. So when it comes to the boat, if you had a more adaptable boat, you can handle more challenging terrain. So I thought this boat was pretty cool. If you look on the right, it's basically a speedboat in its compact form and like a luxury sort of like cruising boat otherwise. And I'm not saying that that boat is adapted to the specific waters that I have pictured next to it, but my point is that like it can handle more things because it's adaptable. So how adaptable is your team? How adaptable is your department? These are questions that I want you to kind of start thinking. So the root problem in this cases are all the same. Even well-meaning people don't really share enough context. And you need to share a lot for things to really stick. Most people need to read something more than once to retain even half of it. And if you read something when you're tired, you're even less likely to retain the things that you did read. And then when you're reading something online, it has an even lower rate of recall compared to hard copy. Do you recognize this? Because it's basically describing a large part of our jobs. Those code reviews you do, 2 p.m., after 2 1-hour-long meetings, when your kid's screaming in the background, yeah, you're not remembering anything from that. It's going to go in one, and most of it's going to go out. You'll have to review it again and again and again. So sharing and learning are very, very difficult things to do. So then we get into comfort zones. I have a friend of mine. He used to call himself the bubble boy because he liked staying in his domain of expertise. He would venture out of it, you know, when his little tendrils needed to go and talk to other things or exposed to other services or whatever. But he generally liked to stay in his own domain. And he was the reigning expert of that domain. And he didn't wield that maliciously or with arrogance or anything like that. It's just comfort zones give you the permission to pass specific people problems in that domain and know and trust that it will get solved. And that's really comforting. But with that, there's a price. You get silos, you get that bust lottery factor is increased, and then it just amplifies the issue of shorter tenures in your company. Because you're left with pieces that others may not understand or even know about. And that segues into our next problem, conformity. So we're social creatures and we want to be accepted. That's sort of a really big thing, especially in a new position, in a new job, in a new company, in a new city, in a new country. So I'm going to go through some of these experiments to kind of prove what I mean. These are very famous examples, and you could find them in no time Googling them. So there's the Ash conformity experiment. And the concept is pretty simple. You as a candidate will go into this experiment, and you would be the only actual candidate in the experiment. But there might be, upwards of, let's say, 10 people in there, and they're all paid actors. And the answer, the question is simple. They present this diagram that I have up for you right here, and they say, what line on the right matches the same length of line on the left? And what happens is the paid actors, some of them answer correctly, but a non-trivial amount of them answer incorrectly and pick something else. In fact, they try to make it so the vast majority, as it goes around, if not all of them, as it goes around, there's variance, will pick a blatantly wrong answer. And you would think, well, who would go along with that? It's so obviously wrong. Look at the diagram. There's no way. But it turns out that in 12 critical trials around this, around 3/4 of the participants gave at least one wrong answer due to consensus among others in the room. 75% of people picked the wrong thing, and they knew it was wrong because everybody else picked it too, and they didn't want to seem like the odd one out. And I know you're thinking, not me, Chris. I'm better than that. I have a mind of my own. I've been like, yeah, they all said that too. Like, you can think that, but you have to be able to recognize these sort of human traits and be able to fight against them. So another more famous one, actually, is probably the Milgram experiment. It's a little more morbid, but this is the idea. I'll go over this diagram that's up here for you first. So in the top left, E, that's the experimenter. T is the teacher, which is the candidate. That's who plays that person. And L is the learner, who is also a paid actor. L is hidden behind a wall of which you cannot see them, but you can still hear them. So what would happen is the teacher asks a question to the learner, and if they get it wrong, they send a small electric shock to the learner. And the experimenter is there to reinforce that action, to tell them, to shock them on the wrong answer. And every time they get a wrong answer, the experimenter, there's variants of it, so either the experimenter or the teacher can increase the voltage, but the voltage must be increased after each wrong answer. And as the voltage increases, the reaction from the other side of the wall from the learner gets more and more dire for every time they get shocked. And this is a case study around how people follow authority. You can look at the specifics. I don't necessarily want to go into the exact specifics of it, but it was something in like the 30 or 40% of people would go to the point where the thing was marked like deadly voltage levels, and they would eventually go there if probed enough by the experimenter, because the experimenter's in a white lab coat and they have an authoritative figure to them. So they do this because the authority assures them that it needs to be done this way. And they continue way past what reasonable people would think when they're watching it from the outside in. So what does this tell us about code, though, right? Code is written by people, and people are divided and placed in groups and through some form of hierarchy, right? I'm focusing on these two specific examples on purpose because I think the first one, refers to team patterns, and the Milgram experiment refers to this concept of perceived authority. So let's start with the team patterns. Everyone here has probably been a part of a new team. And when you write your first new class or a new test, what did you do? Did you write it from scratch? Of course not. You copy and pasted it from some form of starter code, right? I actually asked 12 random colleagues that I work with, and they all told me that they copy-pasted code when they first started, and they actually continue to do so because it's faster in the end. Now, I know that's not like a perfect study and all that, but I'm sure if you ask people around you, they would sort of have similar stories. Because when we're unsure of something and not sure how to start, we copy it because it's already been a solved problem. It's already been vetted, it's already been approved. It's living in the code base. It must have been approved at some point to get merged. So we assume that if it's still around and used, it must have stood the test of scrutiny, and it's okay to propagate. Of course, from the previous thing that we just discussed, we know that there's issues with that assumption, and it might not really be the case. But what about questioning perceived authority? It's a little bit different, because instead of thinking that the code has stood the test of scrutiny, you believe that the person or people of authority have stood the test of scrutiny, and they must know what they're talking about. I found in my experience that this is easier to challenge for newcomers because there's sort of there's a less direct line from the person to the impact that a new person can have, to new output that they can do, as opposed to just copying code and just running with that. And sometimes that challenge can be a great benefit. I have a very close friend of mine who was trying to get pregnant for many years, and they were unable to, so they did one round of IVF, and that didn't work, so they went with a second round, and that almost didn't work because they got to the point where they had to, the eggs didn't, they weren't fertilized the way that they needed to be for the process to continue forward. And they were basically told by the doctors, we're sorry that this one's not going to work. And my friend said, well, don't we have 2 frozen ones from the previous round that we could try? And the doctor was like, that's pretty low likelihood, I'm not sure if that's going to work. And he challenged the doctor on this. And the doctor is, he's the expert in the field, knows the statistical relevance, knows how that's going to, whether it's going to work or not based on hormone levels in the wife and all that. They're the expert, right? But he challenged the doctor on it. They ended up doing it, and now they have a happy, healthy 3-month or 2-month-old, right? So sometimes to great benefit, if you challenge the authority and you have the courage or the previous experience to do so, you can overcome this problem. But the problem with it is that you're still counting on somebody breaking the cycle versus being pragmatic against the cycle. So you still risk that nothing ends up changing. And I don't think it's necessarily worth that risk. Okay, so in practice, what does this actually look like? What are the signals of this, right? So very few people want to speak up to issues that they see in the beginning. They want to be accepted, as I mentioned. And new engineers copy code and patterns that they see to other places. So if undesired code already exists, this is a great way to spread it, almost like a disease through your whole code base, depending on how fast you hire, all that stuff. There's nuance, obviously, around all of this. I'm kind of simplifying it for the purposes of this talk. Okay, so let's bring it all together then. So you have the Hedonic Principle, saying you can write bad code, and that feeling of badness gets forgotten or faded away because you want to deal out new features at a reasonable frequency. You have the Hedonic Motivator, coupled with that. We talked about it reinforces it, and it can also reinforce the behavior of avoiding conflict if some code might be found to be less than stellar. Especially in newer companies, people might not actually stay that long. Institutional knowledge tends to stay in people's heads. And when they leave, might be hurriedly transferred, documented to a lesser degree than maybe if it was systematically shared. It might be a little bit different. It might be spread a little bit more organized. It might be a little more filled out. So a lot of that stays sort of behind this code that no one might actually understand fully or understand the origin of. And when bugs happen, the first thing that every developer turns into an archaeologist when a bug happens and they're trying to figure out what went wrong. Because the question around bug solving isn't how do we fix it, it's why did it happen? Because you need to understand the root cause. If you don't have enough documentation, institutional knowledge around that section of your code, that's going to be much more difficult to do. And it could take quite a bit longer to fix the root problem. So now you find people that are prone to conform, that's the last point here, now you find people that are prone to conform under even fairly slight pressure to do so. So all that odd code that could lead to questions, not only do they keep it to themselves that they think it's weird and might not ask the questions that they should, but then they go one step further and they copy paste it around the code base, spreading it and making it appear in more and more places. So all these aren't siloed issues, right? They all kind of they're all woven together, and some can be more present than others depending on where they are in the company, what the company is doing, where the values are, and what the culture around the engineering teams do. All right, well, now that you know the problems, you know that they all intermingle together, you know that some of them are worse than others. There's a lot of variability, a lot of changes between one company to the other, one team to the other. So how can we make this better? I think there's some certain strategies you can employ that are pretty universal. So for the Treadmill and Motivator, we can change how you look at your tasks and stories. And you can try and build trust into your team. And as a more practical effect, you can try and create a quality guild. So let's start with the first one. The reason new things are cooler than refactoring and documenting, refactoring or documentation or purposeful context sharing is because we make it that way. We see this hierarchy all the time, and quality is usually a secondary concept because it's behind the curtain of product. Salespeople sell salespeople sell things that the product doesn't do and sometimes can't do for a really long time. There's a bit of a disconnect there, but they want to make that sale. They want that new customer. Product sets the roadmap with little input from engineering. And really the only negotiation that engineering might have is we can't build that in the amount of time that you told us. When really the negotiation should be on scope and timeline, not just timeline itself. So when refactoring is considered, it's usually bolted on, and it's not a natural part of the work cycle. The Boy Scout rule is nice on paper, this idea of every time you go into a file, you make it better before you leave. I've heard that a lot, but in practice, I've seen it happen a lot less than it should. So actually, to give an example, a company that I used to work for had something called a refactor-geddon every year. So at the end of the year, the engineering would stop feature work for five or 6 weeks, and they would just focus on addressing whatever tech debt they wanted. We had a big kickoff meeting, teams were formed, we discussed priorities of what to address first, broke off into squads, and managed all of our own work. Product didn't have any say in any of this. And I couldn't help but think that feels a lot like an us versus them mentality. So we can try and advocate for durability as much as we advocate for features. That should be half the job of a tech lead. Build the cases for engineering quality and argue it the way product argues for new things. They should be at the table for these conversations for road mapping, and that should be what your tech lead does. You can have a better senior developer than you do in terms of craft than you do of a tech lead because the jobs are so different. I'm going to say it again. Your technically lower level senior engineer can be a better crafter than your tech lead because the jobs are completely different. Okay. So in order to do this, though, even if you want to advocate, you have to build trust. And trust is very hard. So this diagram that I have here is actually from a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And the first dysfunction listed in that book is the absence of trust. I highly recommend reading this book for more context on this. It's excellent and it's told as a story, so it's very engaging. So their definition is a little bit different than when I say trust. I mean more like openness to communicate honestly, as opposed to the lack of politics, which is what that book tends to focus on. But at its core, it's the same sort of idea. My concept of trust is the first two parts of that triangle: fear of conflict and absence of trust. People should feel comfortable speaking up when things are being debated and negotiating without the fear of negative consequences around that. So remember how I said tech lead should advocate? Imagine if there were part of roadmap discussions, customer interviews, metrics analysis to gain as much context around the problem domain, and then bring in the unique perspective of maintaining high engineering quality. They should be in all these conversations, and they should have an equal seat at the table. It's easy to understand that a more focused eye on quality decreases incidents, but this will still bring up conflict because it slows down product delivery compared to what the team might be used to. That conflict that leads to compromise is the part that relies on trust for the team to succeed. If you cannot have the conflict and people either hide their feelings or they just sort of agree to things because they don't want to deal with all that. That's the part where end quality goes to die. And the only way to fix the plug is to remind the captain that the ship is leaking. Trust must be built into your culture. It can't be bolted on when it's convenient. It's not a one-day fix with a seminar, because old habits die hard. It takes real dedication, real work, and candor is the hardest part of that. So this topic on trust alone can be its own conference talk. So that's why I recommend reading 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. It's by Patrick Lencioni, to learn about propelling the team to high performance. It's about 200 pages, 230 pages. You can read that 2 days. It's very, very engaging. Highly recommend. I don't know if I'm making it obvious. I highly recommend you read this book. Great. So what about making a guild as a more practical concept? So a guild is just a collection of people that are responsible for keeping an eye on quality. It's not their only job. It could be people from product, people from eng. It's a highly sort of flexible structure. Anybody who want in, but part of their time is dedicated to sort of making sure this keeps top of mind. Because everybody wants quality on paper, but this idea puts a team to the task. You can have people cycle on and off the guild every few months so that it propagates out a little bit. They should have their own metrics. They should meet on some reasonable cadence. I think the last guild that I was part of met every 6 weeks to discuss parts. We had action items that people were responsible for getting other people to work on. The members of the guild don't necessarily fix these quality issues, but they are assigned to making sure that there's movement made on them. So you can get a little creative with guild. You can make maybe the guild is a path to promotion. Maybe if you want to be able to go from a senior to tech lead, maybe you have to do some time on a guild to understand what that means. Maybe when people are on a guild, you can pay a guild stipend. Like there's different avenues you can do to make it more enticing to people, but the focus of this guild is to have accountability and keeping these issues top of mind. So, what about this box knowledge idea? Okay, well, knowledge sharing should be just a general goal, right? I mean, if you want to solve the problem of people not knowing things in the code base, then you should make it a priority to share it. And while that sounds so simple on paper, it takes time. And so because it takes time, you should endeavor to add these concepts to your sprint, to your 6-week planning goal, to your monthly planning goal, because lunch and learns, pairing sessions to share this knowledge, all these things take time and effort. So if they're not part of the sprint, they're shoved to the side, they're swept under the rug, and they're never done. So you can do pairing code reviews even. Go through your code review, and then if you're doing a pairing session for actual code to write up a new feature or fix a bug or whatever, delete that code and then turn it around and have the other person do it. Because you want to make sure that the understanding of it is what's cemented. There's too many coding sessions where somebody is driving too much and the other person is an observer, and then when they're done, they might have a general 10 to 15% retainment of what they had, but if they're forced to do the thing they just looked at, they'll retain way more, but it takes twice as long. By doing this though, increasing the amount that you share, making part of your sprints, doing it in pairing sessions, doing code review in pairing sessions, it slowly starts becoming part of your engineering culture. That's the end goal. You need it to be part of something where if it doesn't happen, you want people in your org to call it out. Back to the trust thing, but that's kind of what you need. You need it to be part of the culture. So as a barometer check, can you point to something every week where you actively spread knowledge as an employee yourself? Can you say, I taught this thing to that person, I wrote this documentation for that thing? It's a barometer. It doesn't have to happen every week, but it's like an idea of like, how can you make it more accountable? How can you keep track that it's actually happening? And thirdly, the conformity angle. Because you have people that want to fit in, not question authority, there's a couple things that you can do around this. You can delay the authoritative voices in the room when something comes up. You can have your more junior people talk first, or maybe you can have people write things down and then go around the room and have them share what they wrote down around a problem. When you're solutionizing an issue, when you're spitballing ideas around how to architect something new, if you have your most authoritative people talk first, A, they'll talk with authority, and B, so your more junior people will just think like, oh, that's the way to do it. But you might actually get some really interesting ideas and different perspectives if you let the more junior people talk first. You have to find something that works for you. These are 2 basic ideas. And there's another conference talk around this entire issue of conformity done by Sandy Metz, Keep Ruby Weird keynote of 2015. And I highly recommend it. I'm not going to lie, I stole this concept pretty much directly from her conference talk. It's excellent, much what you would expect from Sandy Metz. So think about those 2 concepts of like how you might be able to decrease the authoritative voice in the room and just give space to your more junior people to have an opinion. They might not have the right opinion or the best approach, and that's where your mentorship can come in. Speaking of mentorships, you should assign mentors, and you should assign them with accountability. Because if you don't assign them with accountability, or you don't have mentors at all, you have something called the tragedy of commons that happens. Because people tend to want to fulfill their own goals first. So if everyone is responsible for the greater good, then really no one is responsible for it. And think back to if you use Slack or HipChat or whatever other messaging you do in your company now, especially now with remote. Think about a question asked to a channel versus a question asked to a specific person. Usually in a channel you might get vague responses, more minimal follow-up. You might not actually have something like seen through all the way. But if you provide a single point of contact, then you tend to break down a lot of those barriers. People become more open. The new hires, they might at first be hesitant to message that one person, but eventually that rapport starts to happen, and they'll message them with more detailed explanations more often. They'll get better explanations from their mentor, and the problems will be addressed more fully than if they were in the channel. I think the channel is good for general questions that are around a piece of software that you're writing to kind of hash out ideas with the team, but more specific, especially onboarding questions around like the early time. I can't get my dev environment to start up. I don't know who do I talk to about this part of the code. Those kinds of questions they're more shy questions, and especially for newer people, going to a specific person, I think is highly beneficial. Now there is one important caveat is you can't just assign any mentor. They have to want to do this. If you have people that you assign as mentors and they're not interested in doing this, they will not make good mentors because they'll just pawn off the questions to someone else and they won't really dedicate the time that they need. Mentorship is a good skill to have as a developer in general. I think we can all agree with that. So hopefully you have more people that are interested and not, or they go through cycles when they're maybe more busy and they can't do it, or they're less busy so they can. But I think it's highly, highly valuable across the org, across the engineering org at any level. I think it's really good to do. Great, so I've added a few things that you could do to fix this thing, right? But I want everybody to remember that all this is human nature. Like nobody's doing any of these things on purpose, right? They're not doing it maliciously. It slowly snowballs. But I'm hoping I gave you some ideas of how you might be able to proactively spot it and maybe even combat it. You're going to make the effort somewhere, right? You can either do it a little bit at a time, or you can do some massive 3-year rewrite on a huge part of your code. I'm hoping that maybe I convinced you that one might be better than the other. And it all kind of comes down back to this diagram, right? You have your environment and your mindset and your behaviors that are working together. You can imagine now that if I've changed your mindset about some of this stuff, it might influence some behaviors that you take out from this that will slowly change the environment. So you'll have to adapt these ideas as you go to really kind of get where you want, and it won't probably ever be perfect. Things always change. But I'm hoping that this cycle loop, the problems I've identified, and some of the strategies that I've talked about can really help you get through this. So hopefully nothing's too rotted, but I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope I'll be around, obviously, to answer questions, Slack and YouTube. I'm not sure how that's going to work quite yet, but I'm around, happy to chat about this more. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.